Welcome to Hagen History Center's October speaker. I'm Jeff Sherry, museum educator here at HHC. Originally, we had planned this event to be live, but this one is tape recorded. And if you have any questions, you can email Stephanie Winsick. I'll be monitoring those, and the ones we send to her, and we'll make sure that she gets appropriate emails. Before we get started, just a few words about what's happening here at the Hagen History Center. Our hours are now 11 to 5, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday only. Currently, we are offering a self-guided driving tour of Erie's Bayfront called Homeport Erie. So you can pick up the driving tour pamphlet and get a copy of the book, Homeport Erie, by Robert J. McDonald and David Frew by stopping in the gift shop here. The cost is $10 per tour, $8 for our members. And please visit our website, www.eriehistory.org, to keep up with us and the events of today and our programs. Be sure to join us on November 11th when Jerry Skripczak will be our speaker discussing the history of the United States Navy in Erie. Our speaker tonight is Stephanie Winsick. Stephanie's talk is called Ghost Stories and Legends of Erie County. Stephanie Winsick is a resident of Erie, Pennsylvania, and author of 7 books: Ghosts of Erie County, More Ghosts of Erie County, Heroes in Disguise, Reaching Through the Veil, Ghost Hunting in Erie County, and Brilliant Souls, and time travel series for children, Northern Lights, and The Journey, a Northern Lights adventure. She publishes historical articles in Pennsylvania Magazine and speaks frequently to local groups and on television and on radio programs. Stephanie graduated from Penn State University in 1977 with a degree in nursing and has worked in the field of developmental disabilities for over 30 years. Certified in developmental disabilities by the Developmental Disabilities Nurses Association in 2000, Stephanie's current position is Associate Director of Nursing, Health Services, and Erie Homes for Children and Adults in Erie, PA. She's recently published a new book about Down syndrome, Brilliant Souls. Now, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Stephanie Winsick.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'd like to share some of the ghost stories and legends of Erie County with you this evening. And as we know, Erie has a lot of history, and sometimes the ghost stories are closely intertwined with that history to the point where it's hard to tell how much of it is legend and how much of it is actually historical fact. Sometimes the stories are so intertwined that it's really impossible to separate that out. But with one of the stories that I'm going to start off with, actually, there's a lot of significant fact that we know of that's true associated with this story, and that's the story of Anthony Wayne. Now, Anthony Wayne was a Revolutionary War general. He was sometimes referred to as Mad Anthony Wayne, only because he was a little bit impetuous, a little bit wild, and some people thought he was a little bit crazy, but actually he was not. He was a very good general. So Anthony Wayne survived the Revolutionary War. And after that, he moved his company of soldiers to Detroit for a while. And after being there for some time, he decided he would rather go to Pittsburgh. So he was moving his company of soldiers from Detroit to Pittsburgh. And during the move, Anthony Wayne got sick. And he happened to be in Erie when he got sick. So he stayed in what is now known as the Wayne Blockhouse, which is a replica of an earlier fort that's located at the foot of Ash Street in Erie. And at that time, back in Anthony Wayne's day, it was called Fort Presque Isle. So he's staying in this blockhouse, and he sent word to his doctor in Detroit to come to Erie and treat his illness. But the doctor, unfortunately, didn't get there in time, and Anthony Wayne died in that blockhouse. So per his request, his soldiers just buried his body underneath the blockhouse. Well, about 13 years later, turns out Anthony Wayne, who was from the Philadelphia area initially, he had a couple children. So his son Isaac had been asked by his daughter if Isaac would come to Erie and have his father's body exhumed and take him back to be buried in the family plot, because the daughter was dying and her last wish was to be buried beside her father. So Isaac agreed to do this. So he gets this little horse and buggy, and he just brought a small buggy because he figured that after 13 years, there wouldn't be much left of a body to come back. So he comes to Erie and he has the body exhumed. And much to everyone's surprise, Anthony Wayne looked fabulous. He really had not deteriorated at all in 13 years. Well, now Isaac has this problem because the buggy that he brought is too small to carry an entire body. So Isaac consulted a physician in Erie, Dr. Wallace, and said, what should he do? And Dr. Wallace suggested that they could just boil that body. So they got this big pot and they stuffed Anthony Wayne's body in it and they boiled it. And it actually worked. It boiled off all the flesh and everything except the bones. So Isaac was able to put the bones in a bag and put them on the back of his buggy, and he went home and he was happy with that. And then the rest of the stuff that was in the pot just got reburied under the blockhouse. Well, that would have been okay, except that Isaac hadn't planned for how bumpy the roads were between Erie and Philadelphia back then. So by the time he got home, unfortunately, he had lost a bunch of the bones off the back of his buggy. So he did have a few left that were buried in Philadelphia or nearby in the family plot. So now we have the Anthony Wayne buried near Philadelphia. He's also buried in Erie. So that part of the story is the fact. Where the legend comes in is that on every New Year's Eve, people say they can see Anthony Wayne's ghost riding his big white horse along the road between Erie and Philadelphia, looking for his missing bones and trying to put himself back together. So again, in this case, it's very clear which part is true and which part is the legend part. But it gets a little murkier as we go along, as you'll hear in the next story. The next story has to do with the War of 1812. Now, if you're familiar with any of Erie history, I'm sure you've heard of the Battle of Lake Erie, where Oliver Hazard Perry and the crew of the brig Niagara were instrumental in helping to win that battle. But the story I'm going to tell you has to do with the winter of 1813, which was after the Battle of Lake Erie, which occurred in September. So that winter, the brig Niagara was docked in Misery Bay at a little area that is now known as Graveyard Pond. So if you're not familiar where that is, if you drive along the peninsula and you get to the Perry Monument at the end of the peninsula, adjacent to that, there's a little kind of marshy, swampy area, and that's a Graveyard Pond. And that's where the brig Niagara was docked for that winter. Now, the ship got iced in, which the sailors had expected because winters here are cold and nasty, and that was going to happen, but they were okay with that. But the problem that they had that winter was that, unfortunately, one of the sailors got smallpox. So smallpox is very contagious, and there's no treatment for it at that time, and most of the people who got smallpox died from it. So there was panic throughout that ship because they knew how quickly this could spread. So as soon as someone died of smallpox, they would wrap them in canvas, put a cannonball on their chest, and throw them off the side of the boat into Graveyard Pond. Well, that didn't slow the spread of the illness. So as the story has it, the sailors decided that they were going to look at the men who were sick with smallpox but weren't quite dead yet. And they thought, well, they're probably going to die anyway, and they're spreading germs while they're here. So we'll just wrap them in canvas and put a cannonball on their chest and dump them off the boat as well. So again, this is a story that has been passed down for years. There is no documentation that this was actually done. Although, as I tell people when I tell this story, if you did that, you probably wouldn't write it down. But again, there's no basis in fact that this is actually what happened. But now, fast forward many, many, many years to 1956. There's this young teenager named Ted riding his bicycle on Presque Isle with his girlfriend, and they're right around Graveyard Pond, and it's starting to get dark. So they decided to hide in the bushes because they knew they weren't supposed to be on Presque Isle after dark, but they didn't want to leave. So they were hiding in the brush by Graveyard Pond. And pretty soon a fog rolled in off the pond. And through the fog, they could see this man walking toward them. So initially they thought it was the park ranger that had caught them and they were going to get kicked out. But as the man got closer, they said, hey, it kind of looks like some guy in a bathrobe. Well, then even as he got closer, they said, it's not a bathrobe. It looks like a tattered old uniform from some war that they couldn't identify. And they also noticed that he appeared to not have any feet, looked like he was just floating over that pond. So they hightailed it out of there. Ted said he never got another date with that girl, and he's never been back there since. But since that time, since 1956, there have been several documented reports of people on Beach 11, which is the closest beach to Graveyard Pond, saying that they saw this same phenomenon. They see the fog roll in and they see this man walking through the fog toward them. Now, if you are familiar with the Erie area, you've probably heard of Joe Root. Joe Root was a hermit who lived on Presque Isle back at the turn of the last century. And he didn't have a house or anything. He just lived off the land, and he enjoyed telling stories to the visitors who would come to Presque Isle. And he would often tell people about these ghosts that he would see coming off Graveyard Pond at night. He said there was more than one. He called them Perry's will-o'-wisps because he was convinced that these were the ghosts of these sailors who had died of smallpox or almost died of smallpox and then got thrown off the boat, and their bodies were never recovered. So again, it's up to you to decide what part of that you think is true and what part of that you think is legend. So now, in other parts of the county, there's of course a lot of stories in the city of Erie, and then there's also a lot out in the county. Now, my hometown of Girard seems to be the winner as far as number of ghost stories that are told over the years, for whatever reason. And a lot of the stories surround these two Victorian houses who are actually part of the Battles Museums of Rural Life these days. But back in the 1800s, these houses were both built by the same man. His name was Rush Battles. Now, the Battles family was very prominent in Girard in the 1800s. Rush's family had come here from Chautauqua County in New York. And Rush's father died when he was 15, when Rush was 15. So he was left with the task of building a home for his mother and his two unmarried sisters to live in. So he built this big yellow Victorian mansion. It's a gorgeous home in 1857 for his mom and his two sisters to live in. And he built it very big because his plan was that when he got married, that he and his wife would also live in this yellow house. Well, when Rush grew older and decided to get married, not surprisingly, his wife said, "I don't really want to live with your mother, Rush." So Rush had to go down the road to the next lot, and he built the smaller white house for he and his wife to live in. So basically, the people who lived in that yellow house were Rush's mother and his two elderly sisters. Well, in the 1980s, after these two houses became the property of the Erie County Historical Society, they hired a young couple to be curators of the house museum that they were planning in that yellow house. So the yellow house appears as an 1850s farmhouse, whereas the white house, which we'll talk about in a minute, is more home-like. It actually contains a lot of furniture and dishes and clothing original to the Battles family, so it's set up a little bit differently. But in the yellow house, the museum is on the first floor, and then there was an apartment on the second floor where this young couple lived while they were taking care of the museum. So initially, they noticed there was a lot of just little things that were weird to them that happened in the house, like they'd be working on the first floor and they would hear footsteps on the second floor when there was nobody up there. They would hear children playing outside, and they would go outside and there'd be no children out there. Sometimes things would tip over for no reason, lamps would fall down, and just kind of peculiar things. And then one night they were both asleep in their bedroom on the second floor, and they both woke up at the same time to see a full apparition of a woman in a long black Victorian gown. And they said she was floating across the end of their bed, and she floated through the closet door and disappeared. So at this point, they were curious, and they decided to have some paranormal investigators come in. Well, at that time, there were no groups like that in Erie. So they went to Pittsburgh, and they found some paranormal investigators who agreed to come up here and check out the house. Well, they didn't really find much of anything on the first floor, but on that second floor in the bedroom where they said they had seen the ghost, they found a lot of evidence on their meters of paranormal activity, particularly around that closet door where they said she had gone in. They also brought with them a woman who was a psychic, and intentionally they didn't tell her anything about the history of the house or who lived there. And she said right away that she sensed the presence of elderly females haunting the yellow house, which makes sense historically because that's who lived there. Rush's mothers and sisters lived there for the bulk of the time. So that house is purported to be haunted. And then the smaller white house where Rush and his wife lived is also haunted. Now, Rush and his wife had 3 children in that White House. 2 of them, unfortunately, died when they were little kids. The third one, Charlotte Elizabeth Battles, grew to be an adult. So she was born in that White House in 1864. She died in the house in 1952, and she lived in Girard in that house her entire life. Now, Miss Battles was a very progressive woman for her time. She was very well educated for a Victorian woman. She had gone to college in Washington, D.C., and she was very involved in the community and educational activities and things like that. So she was very much involved and invested in the Girard community. Now, she married very briefly when she was 23 years old. There's a little bit of mystery around it. Nothing in the records is really clear about why she stopped being married. Apparently, her father went and fetched her home, and the marriage was annulled, and there was nothing more said about it. So Miss Battles never remarried and never had any children. So she was the last of the Battles family to live in Girard. So she devoted her life to serving her community and becoming a successful businesswoman. When her father, Rush, passed away, she became president of the Battles Bank in Girard, which was sort of unheard of for a woman at that time to be a bank president. So she was very involved in all of that stuff. But once her father and mother died, she was living in that White House by herself. So she was lonely. So she asked her friend, Georgiana Reed, would she like to move in with her? So Miss Reed agreed to do that. And the 2 ladies lived in that house for 30 years together. Miss Battles spent her time in the community and with her businesses, and Miss Reed basically took care of the house and managed the Yellow House, which had a series of tenant farmers who would come in there. There was a lot of farmland around the house, and so she had a huge job taking care of that, and she did a very nice job with that. So when Miss Battles died in 1952, Miss Reed continued to live in that White House for another 30 years until she passed away in the 1980s. And then both the homes were willed to the Erie County Historical Society, and they decided to make them house museums and open them up for tours to the public. So in advance of the tours, the Historical Society decided to hire some workmen to come in and sort of upgrade the property. So one day in that White House, there was a plumber working in the bathroom on the 2nd floor, and he believed he was alone in the house. So he had his toolbox in the hallway right outside the bathroom door. And he turned around and picked up a tool, turned back around to go in the bathroom, and all of a sudden there was an old woman standing in the bathroom. Well, he was shocked because there was no way he knew an old lady could get up those stairs that fast. So he spoke to her and she didn't answer. So he got really nervous, and so he grabbed his toolbox and ran out of the house and went down the road to the Yellow House where there were some other people from the museum working, and he said, who is that woman up there? Well, nobody knew anything about a woman. But just for fun, long story short, they ended up showing him photographs of the Battles family, and he positively identified the woman he saw in the bathroom as Georgiana Reed. Now, she had been dead for about a year at that point. So it's very possible Miss Reed is haunting that part of the house. And again, if you think about it, it makes sense because it was Miss Reed's job her entire life to keep track of the house. So if anybody was going to be monitoring the plumber, it was going to be Miss Reed. So that kind of makes sense there. Now, we also feel that perhaps Miss Battles is also still in the house. Now, for years, I did tours through the house, both of the houses, but primarily through the White House. And several years ago, it was the middle of summer. I remember it was very hot and sweltering in the house because it's a museum, we can't open the windows and there was no air conditioning. So the White House was very, very hot. And so I had a tour group on the 1st floor, and there was another tour guide with a group on the 2nd floor. And the tour guide from upstairs called down the stairs and told me to come upstairs right now. So I ran up the stairs into Miss Battles' bedroom, which is at the top of the stairs. The entire tour group was in her bedroom, and there was one man standing in the middle of the group with this petrified look on his face. And the other people in the group were walking around him, kind of putting their hands up to him. If you got your hand within about a foot of this gentleman, there was a wall of icy cold air all the way around him. Now, I am not the kind of person who sees ghosts or senses things like that, but I would bet you anything there was a ghost in that room because it was so hot, there was no way to explain where this cold air came from. And again, if you think about it, Miss Battles was a Victorian woman. All of her things are in that room. So if you're in that situation, you probably wouldn't be happy about having strange men walking around your bedroom looking at your stuff. So in a way, it sort of makes sense. And after that night, Our male tour guides would not go on the second floor anymore because they said every time they would try to walk over the threshold of Miss Battle's bedroom, they would get hit with this icy blast of cold air. Now, during the time that I did tours, there were several people who left the tour because they said somebody grabbed them. Somebody pulled my arm, somebody touched me. One girl said somebody pulled her hoodie and yanked it back when she was walking through the kitchen by herself. So there appears to be quite a bit of paranormal activity in both the houses, but pretty much more in the White House. And that whole area around those two houses has a number of ghost stories associated with it, but for the sake of time, I'm going to skip over most of them and just tell you about Gudgeonville. Some of you may have heard of Gudgeonville. It's about less than a mile from the Battles' homes, and it's basically just a wooded area. It's very densely wooded, and it's dark when you go back there, and there's a couple houses back there, but until 2007, I believe, when it burned in an arson fire, there was a very old covered bridge back in Gudgeonville called Gudgeonville Bridge. Now, almost from the time the bridge was built, people were saying it was haunted. They would hear horses running over the bridge when there were no horses. They would hear people screaming. They would hear children crying. There were all kinds of stories reported about Gudgeonville Bridge over the years. And whether or not it's true, we don't know. Some people may just have been taking their girlfriends and boyfriends out there to scare them because it is kind of a scary place. But one story that is associated with Gudgeonville that I found pretty compelling was a lady called me and she knew I was collecting ghost stories. And she said, you know, I've lived in Gudgeonville all my life. I work at the nursing home in Girard. And so she said, I work second shift, so I have to drive over that bridge every night around midnight. I've done this for 20 years. I never heard a thing. I never saw a thing. And I thought it was all a bunch of hooey. Until one night, she was driving over the bridge, going home as usual, and she saw a woman standing on the bridge holding a baby. Well, that was peculiar because it was the middle of the night. So she stopped her car, ran up to the woman to see if she could help her, and the woman just vanished in front of her eyes. So this is something that telling ghost stories and doing tours over the years, I hear over and over. People, they don't believe until they believe, because something like this happens that they really have no explanation for. So lest you think that all the ghosts are in Girard, they are not. Across the county, let's go across the county to Waterford. Waterford is another very quaint, beautiful little town. And on the main street in Waterford, there's a big stone building called the Eagle Hotel. Some of you may be familiar with that. There's a very nice restaurant in the Eagle Hotel. And that hotel was built around in the 1840s or thereabouts. And it is supposedly haunted by a young woman named Matilda. Now, Matilda was a chambermaid at the Eagle Hotel when it first opened. And she was a very good chambermaid as far as we know, but some people reported that she was a little bit strange. She had some emotional problems. And one day, Matilda reportedly became distraught because she broke up with her boyfriend. So she decided she was going to kill herself. Well, her method of suicide was to set herself on fire. So Matilda went to work at the Eagle Hotel. She set herself on fire, and of course she died. And she also burned down most of the Eagle Hotel in the process. So after the hotel was rebuilt, all the strange things that happened in the Eagle Hotel over the years, even to this day, are blamed on Matilda. The servers will report that in the kitchen, there's a cupboard that won't stay closed. Dishes randomly fall off the wall. If you're there late at night in the kitchen, you can hear someone whisper your name as you walk across the kitchen. So even to the point where when I spoke with a server there some years ago, she said, well, yeah, because when you get a job here, that's part of your orientation is to how to deal with Matilda. Because all you really have to do is tell her to stop it and she'll stop it. So if you get a chance to go over there to Waterford to have a meal at the Eagle Hotel, you can ask about Matilda and they'll probably have some stories for you. Now, one more story before we go, I need to touch on, because this is something people ask me about all the time, is Axe Murder Hollow. Now, Axe Murder Hollow is off of Sterretania Road. So if you drive down Sterretania Road, you're going to come to the Weiss Library. Now, the Weiss Library is now a private residence, so please don't go there and tromp around on their property. But it used to be a library, and it's a very beautiful old building on the corner of Sterretania and Thomas Road. So you turn down Thomas Road, and then you will come to Axe Murder Hollow, which is basically a lot like Gudgeonville. It's just a very dark wooded area with a winding road through it. Now, the legend about Axe Murder Hollow is that years ago, no one knows when this happened, there was a farmhouse back there. And actually, if you walk through the woods, you see there is a foundation of a house that there used to be a house there. So this farmer had a wife and 3 children. And one summer, he decided to hire a farmhand to help him with the work around the farm. So whether it was true or not, he came to believe somehow that his wife was having an affair with this young farmhand. So one night, the farmer snapped. He went out to his shed, got his axe, and he chased his wife and 3 children through Axe Murder Hollow, through the forest. And when he caught them, he chopped them all to pieces. Now, there's a few problems with this story, besides the fact that these people supposedly died. There is no house there anymore. Nobody knows when this happened. There's no documentation that this heinous crime ever occurred, which you would think a crime like that would be in the paper or someone would have documented it. But there is none of that. This is just a story that where it came from, we don't know, but it has been handed down through the Erie area for decades and decades. And people, when they go out there, they'll say at night they can see a light bobbing through the forest. That's the farmer with his lantern as he's running through the forest, trying to catch up with his family. So another problem with that story is that there is almost an identical legend that has to do with gypsies. Supposedly a band of gypsies were camped out in Axe Murder Hollow back in the 1930s. And one night the gypsy king became enraged with the gypsy queen because he thought she was having an affair. So he got his axe and he chased her through the woods and he cut her head off and he buried it in the basement of the Weiss Library. So again, there is no documentation that this ever happened, but people still go out there on Halloween and they still tell this story to this day. Now, and there's one more little sort of an urban legend that has to do with Axe Murder Hollow. So when you drive down Thomas Road, you're going to go over 3 little bridges. So if your car stalls or you stop on that first bridge, you'll be fine. And if you stop on the second bridge, you'll be fine. But if your car stalls on that 3rd bridge on Thomas Road, then you're never coming back from Axe Murder Hollow. So thank you for your attention and happy Halloween.